Hello everyone. Today we are going to learn how to use React's useContext to create a user state that can be accessed all throughout our React app. To get started, first we need to understand the concept behind React Context. React Context was created as a way to avoid prop drilling in React, where one parameter is passed endlessly through components, creating a very messy code and developer nightmare. What React Context allows us to do is create a context variable that gets passed through all our child components, and those child components can then access the state variables using the useContext hook that React provides. To demo this, we're going to create a very basic application that uses React useContext to manage user state across the React app. Let's dive in. To get started, we will use Next.js to create our React app. So we'll say npx create next app, and then we'll also add the optional TypeScript flag. If you don't want to use TypeScript, you can omit this flag. However, I highly recommend using TypeScript in all of your projects. Also, using Next.js to create your React app is not required. You can just use create React app. However, Next.js helps automate a lot of things, and I personally really enjoy Next.js, so we will be using it for this tutorial. Once your create next app is finished, go ahead and type npm run dev to start your application. You may see instructions to install TypeScript, and if you do, please follow those and then continue on. Once npm run dev is finished, you should be able to navigate to localhost 3000 to view the default Next.js app. Next, we're going to go ahead and navigate to our index file in our home directory under pages in our app, and we're going to delete all the content inside of it. One point of note is I'm using Tailwind CSS to style this project. Now you don't have to do this, but if you're hoping to follow along, then you're going to have to install Tailwind CSS along with your projects. To do this, visit the Tailwind CSS guide for creating with Next.js and install the dependencies, create your configuration files, and then import Tailwind CSS into your app.tsx file. With that out of the way, let's begin coding. Now the first thing we are going to do is create a new directory called lib, and we're going to add the file user.context.ts to it. Inside of this file, we are going to use the create context function provided by React. We're adding types to it as well, which is optional, and if you're using TypeScript, you should do this, but if you're using JavaScript, you can skip this section. But basically, we're setting the one variable to be a type user, and our second variable, the set user, to be a function that takes in a user or undefined and returns void. Now we have to define the user, so we're going to go ahead and create another directory called types, and inside of it we're going to create our user.ts file. For the purpose of this project, the user type will only consist of the name and email strings, and then we're going to go ahead and export that from the file. Back inside our user.context file, we are going to set the default values of user to undefined and set user to an empty function. Next, we're going to create our useUser hook that our rest of our application and nested components can use. We initialize it by using the react.useContext function, and we're passing in our user context. In order for the rest of the application to use this, we have to provide it to them. We will do this by first creating a useState variable of user and set user inside of our myApp file. Then we will wrap the component HTML tag around with a userContext.provider. Then from our useState above, we will pass in user and set user to the values of our userContext.provider. These are the default values that then will be used throughout the app. To see this in action, we are then going to create a components directory, and inside of it we will do header.tsx. This will be a simple stateless component that uses the useUser hook. We can then extract the user using the useUser hook. Then we will return a simple header using Tailwind CSS to add some very basic styling. And then inside of the header, we will either include the user.name or a string that says no user if user is undefined. Now if we navigate to our index.tsx file and add our header component to it, you should be able to go to localhost 3000 in your browser and see this in action. Currently, no users should show in the header because we haven't actually set a user yet. But before we set a user, I want to clean up how we're implementing our user context. Mainly, I don't want to have the use state used inside of the MyApp component, as that should really only be used for initializing your component tree. So back in user.context, we will create our own custom component called userProvider. UserProvider takes in the children, which is the JSX elements passed through it through the widget tree. Here is where we will initialize the useState hook with a user and set user. And then we will return the user context.provider as seen in the app, just with the values passed from the useState above, and then we will return the children inside of that. With this implemented, back in MyApp, all we have to do is replace that user.provider with a simple userProvider imported in from our user.context file. And now if you compile it again and run the website, everything should work as normal, but it's a little cleaner of a setup now. Now we need to be able to set the user at some point. So in our index.tsx app, we're going to get user and set user from the user hook provided by user.context. And we also use two useState hooks for a simple form in setting the user. Inside of this component, we are rendering a very simple form element. To do this, under header, we are going to create a simple input field consisting of a div with some styling, and then under it, a label for name, and then an input for name as well. We are also going to add the value field to be set to the name, which is from the useState hook above, as well as the onChange hook. We are then setting the name using the useState hook above to the target.value, which is the text in the field. And then we'll go ahead and do the same for email, changing the value to email and the onChange to be set email of the target.value. Lastly, we will have a button with on the onClick function. All it will be doing is it will be calling set user to the name and email fields of the text boxes above it. In our browser, if we go ahead and run this, and then we enter a name for our name field and an email, and then we click the set user, you'll see in our header component, the user is being set. This is user.context in a nutshell. What this allows us to do is it allows us to manage state from different components along the render tree, but it has one single source of truth in our user.context. To illustrate this further, we can go ahead and create an h1 tag above everything, and with some basic styling, we're going to set the user to a json.stringify of the current user. Notice when we enter a new user and call set user, the user shown in the h1 tag is updated accordingly with the header. Now this is really cool, and if we could stop here if we wanted to, but commonly in an app, if you're getting the user, you're going to want on the initial page load to see if the user is already logged in, and if so, to get that user. To implement this, we're going to go back to our user.context file, and we're going to use another React hook called useEffect. Now useEffect is a function that takes in an inner function that runs once on page load and then once the dependencies have changed. However, because we only want this to run once, we're going to pass an empty array into our dependencies. Inside of here is where you would want to fetch your user. Now for the purposes of this demo, we are just going to use local storage to get the user. However, if you were building a project, you would probably be doing a REST or GraphQL request to get the user. But for us, all we're going to do is create a user variable, and we're going to set it to json.parse and the local storage for the get item of user. Now if a user is included, this will return the user, and then if that item is null, then it'll be undefined. So we're then going to set user to that. Now I also want to implement a loading feature as well to this. So to do that, we're going to create another useState hook above that's going to be loading and set loading, and we're going to default it to true. Under set user, then we can set the loading to false. This then allows the components that use the user to see if user is undefined or if it just hasn't been fetched yet and return a loading indicator. We are also, to show the request being made, Gonna wrap this in a set timeout with a time of 3 seconds or 3000 milliseconds. Then inside of our user context, we can add the field loading, which is of type Boolean, and then of course we're going to default it to true. And we will add the loading to our user context .provider below. To see the loading in action, we can go back to our header, and from the use user hook, we're also going to get loading. And then inside of our div, we're going to check if it's loading, and if it is, then we're going to return loading. Otherwise, we're going to check if there's a user, and if there is, then return the user.name. Otherwise, return no user. And then back in our pages index file, we can go in our onSubmit button. We're going to set the local storage.setItem user to be the JSON stringified of user. Now what this allows us to do is we can close the tab in our browser and then reopen it, and you'll notice that it stores the user. First it'll show a loading indicator, and then it'll show the user. So there you have it, a functioning prototype illustrating what React use context can do and how we can store one variable across all of our app, in this case a user provider. Now you can have multiple providers all throughout your app, and the possibilities of this are endless. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, as we will be making more videos in the future.